Welcome, welcome. I'm glad you got to hear some stories already. I'm assuming you did get to hear at least some set of stories, yes? Yes, wonderful. And thank you for coming, and thank you for watching your distancing so that we can be all safe together, because otherwise that's pretty scary in of itself, is it not? Now, someone here is from the Manti area, so I have to tell this first story. So in your honor, yes?
Thank you.
Okay, well, you will not mind if I tell a story that comes from Manti. Okay, good. Oh, you're Manti as well? Who was that?
No, I used to live there years ago, but I love Manti.
Oh, wonderful. Good. Well, good. This is for you too. This is for you too, and for everybody. Henry John worked hard on the Manti temple. But sometimes people would stare at him. There was something different about his leg because it was a peg leg. The adults would look and not say anything, but the children, the kids, sometimes they can be cruel, and sometimes they can be mean without knowing it. And they would call him Peg Leg or Peg Leg John. But luckily, Henry John had a sense of humor, and he would tease them back and said, when I lost my leg out there in Wales, I knew that someday on Resurrection Day, I was going to go out and sail to Wales, get my leg back, I'll put it on, I'll foot race you, and I'll beat you then. And then the kids would laugh and run off. And Carl Hellion, he was 13 years old, and he would watch this, and he was in awe of this humor, of his nice take on life. He never spoke out against the kids, and sometimes he felt like he should have. But in the meantime, he was busy at work. He had 2 donkeys to take care of, Jack and Bodine, and sometimes he would take some sugar and slip it to him, one of his favorite things to do. But he always loved to be able to talk with Henry John. Now, Carl lived with his sister. His sister had been married, and he lived there with his sister and with Mark. But sometimes Carl didn't exactly feel at home there. He knew that Mark deep down would probably have preferred that Carl still lived with his ma and pa. But the sister insisted, and so Carl still lived there. Well, one day, when Carl came back from helping out and talking with Henry John and working with the donkeys, when he made it into his sister's home and he opened that door, there was something wrong. He smelled blood. It was so thick, it just assaulted his nostrils. And he looked all around. He saw that there was a doctor, and the doctor was right near his sister. Now, his sister was expecting. And his first thought was, oh no, the baby, there's something wrong, and the doctor's here. And Carl waited for this bad news. And the sister turned to Carl and said, oh, it's Mark. Something happened to Mark. He was out there in the woods. He was out there with Archie and John, and the tree, it fell down. It didn't fall like it should have, and it fell on Mark and his hand. His hand. And so Carl looked, and now he could see the cloth, and there was the blood, but there was that stump of where Mark's hand was to be. And he could see how Mark just hung his head. And Carl wished that there was some way that he could console him. Now, during the night, Carl would lay there awake thinking about what had happened to Mark and how he was going to survive the next day, when in the middle of the night he heard, "My hand! My hand!" And Carl sat up in bed. Throughout the whole night, he heard this. And in the morning, he learned from his sister that sometimes there's what's called phantom pain. That she had turned to Mark and said, "Does it hurt? Your wound, does it hurt?" And all Mark would say is, "Oh, my wound does not hurt, but my hand. But your hand is not there, but my hand." Carl shared this with Henry John. And when Henry John heard this, he said, well, I've had my peg leg for a while now. I think I know a little something about this. Has he been visited? And Carl shook his head. Well, he needs to be visited by me. You go on ahead. I'll be there. Tell Mark I'll be there. So Carl ran ahead to his sister's home, and there was Mark. He could do nothing. He just laid there. And they prepared for Henry John's visit. And finally Henry John came, and they had biscuits and honey, and they ate. And there across from the table, Henry John looked at Mark and said, your body's grieving. I know how this is. We have our physical bodies, and then a leg, a hand, something is missing, something's lost, and our spirit knows it. And your spirit body is grieving for your hand, and I know this pain. And Mark looked up, and for the first time looked into the eyes of someone, looked into the eyes of Henry John. And then Henry John left. But this conversation, Carl was in the other room. He had overheard it, and he thought about if he could only find that hand. And he looked for Archie. He looked for John. He said, you were there. Where was it? Please take me there. And John said, oh, I'm not going into those woods, not after that accident, and not when I know I've seen a ghost out there before. I will not go out there. But Archie, he said, I'll go. We need to find that hand. And so Archie and Carl headed out into the woods, deeper and deeper, until finally there was a tree with dead branches that was sprawled across this young evergreen. And Archie pointed and said, you see those saddle-sized stones? That's where Mark fell. If that hand is going to be anywhere, it's going to be there. And so Carl climbed carefully over the stones, and he looked, and finally he saw it. It was a leather glove, and it was curled up, and it even looked a little mummy-like. And for the first time, Carl realized he didn't know how he was going to carry this hand back. And he felt all around his pockets, and he found a handkerchief, and he wrapped it around the hand, and he handed it to Archie to carry, but Archie said, no, you can do that. And so Carl took it, and he headed back to the cottage, and he called for Mark and said, Mark, I found your hand. It's time to bury it. And then Carl went not far from that cottage, and he started to dig. And Mark actually went out the cottage, and he watched as Carl dug. And when Carl was done with that hole, he took that hand, and Mark looked at it. He unfolded the handkerchief. He studied it. He was quiet for a long time, and then he placed that handkerchief back. Then Carl was about to lift up a handful of dirt and toss it to cover the hand, but then Mark said, no, this is something I must do. And so with his good hand, Mark awkwardly tried to cover up with dirt. It took a while, but it happened. And then Mark stood up, and he looked. He turned to Carl and said, you saved me this day. You've saved me. And now my hand, I feel no pain. And that is the story of Mark. Now that is a story that was told with permission, that was gathered from the author Shirley Ballman. She actually published it in Isn't That Odd? It's a whole series of pioneer stories, and that was from that. And so I was glad to Shirley to give me permission to tell that today.